Donald Trump has slapped massive import taxes on India. He's been accused of trying to mess with the minds of people who live in Greenland, and he's hosting a meeting related to Gaza, but no one actually knows what it's about. Lots for us to try and work out on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. So we need to follow up the news about Taylor Swift's engagement. I thought, who is the BBC correspondent who could give us the best insight? So we've got James Landale.
You know what? I'm more Jonathan Swift than Taylor Swift. So I can tell you a lot about
how was his love
18th
life?
century satire rather than 21st century mass popular music. But clearly, hugely significant. I'm not sure what it means for US Ukrainian relations or what it means for the future of the Middle East, but I'm sure it's very interesting.
I can tell you spent many a year filling for hours on the news channel from that answer. Luckily, we do have Caitriona Perry on the line from Washington. She's back from her holidays. Hello, Caitriona.
Hello. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling 22.
Oh, lovely.
Boom, boom.
I mean, it's a great love story, and it's definitely not a cruel summer, blah, 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 blah.
And there's no
right,
blank
do you know what,
space
though?
on the ring finger now.
No, and she had great style in those photos. Exactly. James, welcome to what it's like having you know what it's like having teenage children. We're just recreating it for you. Anyway, right, here is how the news of the Taylor Swift-Travis Kelce engagement was broken to President Trump. Let's hear it.
I have to tell you the biggest pop culture news of the year broke while we were in this cabinet meeting. Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift are engaged, and the world wants your reaction, sir.
Well, I wish him a lot of luck. I think he's a great player. I think he's a great guy, and I think that she's a terrific person. So I wish them a lot of luck.
I'm serious.
Right, I thought we'd do like a little mini album of US and diplomatic news at the start of this episode because there's quite a few things that we need to check up on. So first of all, Caitriona, we were talking about a minute ago about how Donald Trump was cold on Taylor Swift and is now warmed up to her. But actually, when it comes to India, he was quite warm towards India earlier this year, and now he's gone cold on them, and it's all to do with their relationship with Russia.
Cold, even frosty, you could probably say, in terms of the tariffs which are coming into effect now. 50% tariffs on India imposed by the president. It was 25% and then an extra 25% because India is such a big customer when it comes to Russian oil. Second biggest customer, second only to China. China has 55% tariffs imposed on it by President Trump. So yeah, very strong language coming from the president. I mean, obviously we've seen over the last few months him delay the impact of tariffs on other countries and blocks of countries. Not the case here, and it's really causing a lot of concern about the future of US-India trade relations, but broader relations as well, because the Indians are expecting this is going to damage their economy to the tune of about $5 billion. So massive amount of cash. And also here in the US, the potential for impact in very particular sectors, textiles in particular, stuff like shoes, clothes, diamonds, jewels, jewelry, and so on. So potentially a lot of impacts right around the globe, really, for this one.
And James, is this another kind of proof point about whether Donald Trump is getting tough on Putin or whether he's going soft on Putin? Is this another kind of bit of evidence that suggests maybe he's going in a more anti-Russian direction because he's doing this to India because they're being like pro or neutral towards Russia?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, if he follows this through, will damage Russia's ability to keep its economy going, fueling the war machine. Because clearly, selling cheap energy to India and China is a key driver of the Russian economy at the moment. But of course, the first question we need to ask is: does Donald Trump follow through on this tariff and sustain it? Tariffs only have an impact if they're held on for a long period of time. We know that, the tariffs have gone up and down since January. How long is this going to last? The second question is, actually, will it continue? Will it not just be limited to India, but will it actually be imposed on China as well? Because that's the crucial one, whether or not the Americans are willing to go that far. Because a lot of commentators have been saying actually they won't go that far because the US do not want to have a trade war with China that's even worse than it already is. And secondly, they don't want to do anything that's too inflationary. Because, the more you restrict and take Russian and Chinese energy out of the market, that means you create demand elsewhere. And the last thing that the US and the White House want at the moment is more inflationary pressures, because that will damage his attempt to repair the US economy. So it's interesting but also it's interesting that it hasn't happened as part of a package. If Donald Trump had gone to Anchorage just a few days ago and met President Putin and said, right, if you do not shift on your position on Ukraine, then I am going to put sanctions on the Indians and the Chinese, and I'm going to crack down on your shadow fleet that's selling oil around the world secretly. And thirdly, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to expropriate all those frozen Russian assets. If it was part of a package that was really tough, then potentially you had some leverage. Here it sort of comes after a weekend of mucko chummo stuff in the back of the beast with all smiles all round. That's why it's another example of the slight inconsistency in the messaging.
If I can just add on to what James was saying there, the other thing to note about this tariff, which President Trump is saying because India is such a big customer of Russia and its, support for its efforts in its war in Ukraine. When Narendra Modi was here in Washington, D.C. earlier in this year at the White House, and the leaders gave a joint press conference, and they were talking about how India was going to start buying huge amounts of American oil. And I think part of this also is President Trump trying to make a case that India would continue on that contract that Modi promised, but which hasn't been followed through on since. So yes, there might be quite big aspirations in relation to the Russia-Ukraine situation, and which James has explained there. But I think there might be something else a bit more America first about it as well, because as we know, that's everything that motivates President Trump.
Caitriona, tell us about this slightly weird-sounding story about Greenland and the Danish Foreign Ministry accusing Americans of sort of stirring up anti-Danish sentiment there.
It's been a few months since we've been talking about Greenland. I mean, it really dominated those first few weeks of this Trump administration, didn't it? And then, of course, that visit by J.D. Vance there. Now we have the situation where the Danes are summoning the US representative in Copenhagen for a meeting. There isn't an ambassador there in place at the moment, although President Trump has tapped Sergio Gore, his 38-year-old head of basically the HR office in the White House, will be the new Danish ambassador, subject to Senate confirmation. But it's the chargé d'affaires that's there who's been summoned in because the Danes say they have evidence of some American nationals in Greenland seemingly gathering information or trying to gather information to mount some kind of effort to push for Greenland to separate itself from Denmark, which, as we know, is a very controversial thing. It's something that President Trump and many members of his team have been talking about for months now, which the Danish PM and all of the Danish representatives have pushed back very firmly on, saying, no, Greenland and Denmark are together and they're not for splitting up.
James, interesting that Denmark aren't just sort of putting their fingers in their ears and ignoring this as like some kind of crazy idea that could never happen. They're actually engaging with it quite directly as a concept in quite a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and I think that they have to be. They've got a very tricky job here because on the one hand they have to push back if there is this idea of internal influence by the Americans, then they have to push back. But equally, they have to push back in a way that is not saying, Greenland is ours, because they need to respect the wishes of the people of Greenland, and so there's quite a sort of delicate act for them to play here. But it is still astonishing. Denmark, like the United States, were both founder members of the NATO military alliance. The fact that this is happening again is just one of those pinch yourself moments that this is the modern way of the world, and that relationships that previously would have been on a very different plane are now you're summoning ambassadors, you've got people walking the streets of Nuuk. I mean the thing is, the thing that strikes me about this story that's really interesting is that Greenland is a very big place, but with a very small population, has sort of 57,000 people, I think. So
everyone will know one of these people.
Everybody knows everybody, and they're all, the vast majority are populated in the capital, Nuuk. And so if there are any, Americans there who are known to be, connected to Donald Trump, they're not going to be able to hide. There is nowhere to hide, and so any kind of foreign influence, it's different to what I'd call foreign influence in bigger societies. So, for example, like the UK at the moment, this year, you'll remember, introduced a special register of foreign influencers. In other words, people who are here at the direction of a foreign government to promote that government. They are obliged to register with the British government, and if they don't, it's a criminal offence. And in other words, we're talking Chinese, we're talking Russians, we're talking Iranians, various people. And the question is in the British society, in developed society, that's a very subtle thing. If you're in a society of 57,000 people, it's a very, very small group of people there. You're in a slightly different scale, and so there's a small question mark in my head about when I first heard this story about just how professional is this operation that we're talking about here.
And also, Caitriona, like the US doesn't necessarily need to do under the radar psyop, and the US doesn't necessarily, Caitriona, have to do under the radar psyops in Greenland. I mean, like JD Vance came over and directly met with the opposition on the eve of the German election. Sometimes they do it very much on the radar.
Exactly. And as James said, you're not talking about a very densely populated area. Things are noticed when they're there and what they're doing. And, there has been polling there. The people of Greenland do not want to leave Denmark and join America either. And we saw when JD Vance was there, initially there was this big trip organised and his wife was to go and his children were to go, and it was all scaled down because the Advanced Protocol Party had met with a lot of resistance there. There weren't people that wanted to come out and be part of a big welcoming party for the Second Lady and so on. So, it feels partly also, perhaps it's one of these distraction tactics that we talk about so much with President Trump as well, that he's trying to take the focus off many other topics, take your pick really at this point in time. But, again, as James said, the Danes have to be seen to be doing something about it.
And Caitriona, on a completely different subject, as we're recording this episode of Newscast, the White House is getting ready to host a series of meetings about Gaza. But I'm not clear what the meetings are about. Are they about Gaza now? And what kind of ceasefire deal could you arrange? And could you get the hostages back to Israel? Or whether it's about the future of Gaza after all of this, if this ever ends?
Well, you're not the only one who is unclear on that, Adam, because despite the best efforts of myself and all our colleagues here, and indeed colleagues in the other American media outlets as well, we haven't been able to get any clarity from the White House about just what's happening today. The US Special Envoy for Everything, Steve Witkoff, said on Fox News last night that there would be a, quote, large meeting taking place today on the future for Gaza. The day after was the kind of phrase that he used that we hear used so often. But there haven't been any more details coming from the White House as to who is attending that meeting, even what time it's happening at. I don't think we'll probably find out about it in advance. We may find out something about it after the fact. The Israeli Foreign Minister is here in town. He's meeting with the US Secretary of State and National Security Advisor and two other jobs as well, Marco Rubio, later today. Again, no press conference. They're going to pose for the cameras for a photograph, a photo opportunity, but there's not any anticipated question time or press conference or anything around that. So it's all quite curious as to just what is happening here. And the White House, when we've asked for comment today, have just said President Trump remains committed to finding a solution and talks are ongoing. But anyone's guess at this point.
Caitriona, I know you're going to have to go, so I'll say goodbye and thank you to you.
Thank you. A pleasure as always.
And yeah, James, what's your take then on the Middle East related shenanigans in the White House this evening?
Well, the idea of thinking about what happens after the war, particularly the status of Gaza and what happens there in terms of its reconstruction, its security, its governance, is clearly something that has to be discussed. Not just because it's something that has to be discussed, but also because it is going to be a key. The fact of it will be a key element of any kind of long-term political settlement, because it's only with some kind of political horizon and security and logistical horizon that you get on board the support of external parties to this conflict. In other words, countries in the Gulf and elsewhere. They have to know that if you're going to say to a country, like the UAE, will you contribute military force to secure Gaza in the short term, they will only do that if they think there's a Gaza to secure, if there's a political process, if there's some kind of legitimate representation and governance. And so you have to get to that sort of place. So it's not just a question about stopping fighting, it's a question about what happens next. Where I think that that conversation has to happen, it's not hastily arranged meetings whose status is unclear and whose membership is unclear at the White House. This is going to be a much broader conversation. A lot of those conversations have happened already, but it's not just going to happen overnight. This is a long, detailed negotiation as part of a process. And I think that the next phase of that will be probably when we get to the UN General Assembly next month, when various countries, including the UK and France and others, are likely to recognise officially the state of Palestine and to see what that unlocks, if anything.
And one of the conditions that Keir Starmer put on Israel in terms of him recognising a Palestinian state at the UN in September, in a few weeks' time, was improving the humanitarian situation in Gaza and access for aid to Palestinians. Is there any sign that Donald Trump is changing his position on that? Because he seems to have been quite kind of hands-off with the Gaza humanitarian situation, other than setting up the new humanitarian foundation, the much criticised new aid delivery setup. Is there any sign that he's maybe going to have a word with Netanyahu about the situation humanitarian-wise?
Thus far, occasionally the Americans do talk about the humanitarian situation, but not in a sustained way, and not in a way that in any way, I think, leaves the Israeli government feeling that it's put under pressure from them.
James, lovely to catch up. I've got to ask, how's the beard going?
Well, it's sort of there for a bit. I fear for its life. It might not survive contact with that much reality, but it's still there for the moment, holding its own.
Good. Keeping the men's facial hair end up for us all. Thank you. Although it does sound like you're a bit ambiguous about it.
It's not that I'm ambiguous. It's that there are
It's
others.
the world is.
There are others in my life who do not share the certainty.
Say no more. Say no more. James, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, yesterday, Reform UK well and truly seized the airwaves with the unveiling of their new policy on deportations for what they describe as illegal migrants. Today, the government tried to wrestle the airwaves back, and the way they did it was a speech by Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Cabinet Office Minister, who's responsible for UK-EU relations, who gave a few more details and tried to spell out some more benefits of the government's reset with Brussels. He did that in a speech and conversation with Michael Gove, one of the godfathers of Brexit, who's now the editor of The Spectator magazine. They had a tete-a-tete in Westminster, and then I had a tete-a-tete with Nick Thomas-Symonds, with him sitting in the Newscast studio at Westminster. Nick Thomas-Symonds, hello.
Hi, Adam. Very good to join you.
Yeah, so, what made you want to go and sit down with Michael Gove, arch-Brexiteer?
Well, I wanted to take the argument out today about the benefits, the tangible benefits, what's going to make a difference to families up and down the country as a consequence of the new deal that we've agreed with the European Union back on the 19th of May. And I want to talk about those advantages, talk about the advantages in jobs, renewable jobs that we can create in the North Sea, for example, tens of thousands of them, or whether it's on borders and having more secure borders, because we can share, to a greater extent, criminal records and biometric data, but also then on trade as well, on bills. Talking about the new agreement in food and drink that we're now going to be looking to implement that's going to reduce trade barriers. And as supermarkets have been saying, we'll have that downward pressure on prices for the weekly shop that's going to be so important for people, particularly with the pressures they face.
Well, you say you're going to implement this deal on food and animal standards. Actually, you have to negotiate it first, don't you? Because the deal that you did earlier in the year was a deal to negotiate some other deals.
Well, so there were some things that were finalised on the 19th of May. The Defence and Security Partnership was signed that day. Very important, particularly at this moment with the war in Ukraine after Putin's illegal invasion. But we will now be moving forward to implement other aspects of it. And in relation to the SPS
well, no, you've got to
agreement,
negotiate the SPS deal. Then you can implement it.
Well, no. You look at the text of the Common Understanding. You'll find the principles of the SPS agreement are already in it. What we will now look to negotiate are going to be particular carve-outs where we want to continue to diverge, but then we are actively making a choice of having common high standards because it's going to reduce costs for businesses. And just to give you one example, Adam, take export health certificates. Now, that is a fee that is paid when a business in the United Kingdom wants to export animals or animal products, so particular food products, obviously, to the EU. It's £200 per consignment. So that's not per year, not a one-off fee, not for an entire lorry, but per consignment. And I want to be in a position where we can sweep away those costs. And we want to be there at the next general election, actually with that message that is looking forward. It's the Conservatives and Reform and Nigel Farage saying they're going to undo this deal and put those costs back onto businesses, back onto the weekly shop. They're going to be the ones that are looking backwards.
And that sort of what you just said there kind of suggests why you did the speech today. This was as much about attacking Nigel Farage, or at least kind of trying to frame his position, as it was selling the benefits of your deal.
So first and foremost, it is about the benefits of this deal. Also, the free trade agreement we have with India, indeed the economic deal with the United States. That's what I've been out making the case for today. But absolutely it is about the opposition parties owning up to the positions that they've got and owning up to the consequences of the positions they've got. If they want to unravel this deal, if they want to put jobs at risk, if they want to take away from people tools to keep our borders more safe, if they want to take that risk of people's household bills going up, they should front up about that to the British public. And that's absolutely the message that I was taking in that speech today.
I mean, Reform have only got 4 MPs in Parliament. Why does a party with only 4 MPs basically get a whole speech directed at them from you?
The speech was directed to the British public. It wasn't directed to particular politicians. It was making the case for the advantages of what we had negotiated, and also setting out, by the way, how by 2027 I want to have that food and drink agreement in place so people can feel the benefits. So that's the purpose of the speech. But absolutely, it is also about setting out the government stall for its vision of the future. The fact that we are making that hard-headed analysis of what is in our national interest in the mid-2020s, not going back to the Brexit debate of the past, but looking forward and, yes, challenging the opposition parties. That to actually own up, as I say, to the consequence of their position. By the way, neither party even read this deal before they came out in opposition to it. That is not acting in the national interest, and they should be honest about that.
When you talk about the SPS deal, sanitary and phytosanitary, which you say will be fully in place by 2027, is that the target date for that?
Yes, and that's what I've been talking about today. Obviously, the EU has its own internal processes to go through. There's some negotiation to go in terms of the carve-outs, and I'm working not just within government, but with stakeholders as to what the most important things are in that regard. There'll have to be as well a piece of legislation to go through Parliament, but I'm going to relish that debate with the opposition parties when it comes. So that is to do, but that's the target I've set today, which I believe is a realistic one, and I've set that because I don't want businesses up and down the country paying these fees that they're paying at the moment for any longer than they need to. And I also want the benefits to be felt by the British public as soon as possible.
I mean, export health certificates are paid for British exporters to send products to the EU. So that doesn't help to bring down the price for British consumers, does it? That makes it cheaper for European consumers. It means they can get more British products.
But it's both ways, isn't it, in terms of reducing non-tariff barriers. And also, of course, costs that businesses here in the UK are paying obviously has an impact on our domestic economy, obviously. Adam. So that does make a big difference. It's why, for example, thousands of businesses have stopped exporting to the EU altogether because of these barriers. And secondly, by taking away these barriers, it enables our businesses to export more and to grow more. So it's most definitely got this effect. And by the way, don't take my word for it in terms of the downward pressure on prices of the household shop here in the UK. Look at what the leading supermarket said when we negotiated the deal on the 19th of May. They've been very clear about the downward pressure on prices here in the UK.
In terms of the process, once this deal is in place and you have implemented it all, so Parliament will be able to vote on the terms of the deal overall and the specifics of it. But then once it's in place and we are having the same standards on food and animal products as the EU, there won't be any more votes for MPs when those standards change, will there? That's what dynamic alignment is. You just automatically do it in the UK.
Well, so let's just take this stage by stage. The first stage is we will...
I know, I did hurtle through it there.
So you did it at speed. We will then have a piece of primary legislation on the SPS agreement that will go through Parliament in the usual way. So MPs across both houses can have their say on it and they can take a position for or against it as they see fit. You will then have a situation where, yes, this government is making a sovereign decision to follow common high standards. And we're doing that firstly because we believe it's in the British national interest. It's in the interests of consumers and businesses to reduce costs. Also in the interest, by the way, of being able to reduce the number of checks across the Irish Sea, which is hugely important as well. We will have internationally a rule-shaping role. But I would also point out as well that just as we have a free trade agreement with India that we've secured, we obviously have the economic deal with the United States. Any free trade agreement that you enter into as a sovereign independent nation has to have an arbitration mechanism. This one is no different. It has an arbitration mechanism that is independent. So if there are disputes, and by the way, we are taking a choice of not engaging in a race to the bottom. We are taking a choice of common high standards. But if you have a relationship as broad and deep in trade terms as ours is with the EU, of £800 billion of trade a year, you are going to get some of these disputes. And then what will happen there is there will be an independent arbitration panel that will then adjudicate upon it. So when we come to these sovereignty arguments, and you'll know them very well, Adam, from your days doing Brexit cast in the past, I reject what opponents say about this. This is an exercise of sovereignty, just as the other free trade deals are an exercise of sovereignty. Choosing to align on high standards is an exercise in sovereignty. And the truth is as well, the reality of it is alignment is happening anyway, but we're not getting the economic benefit for it. You may recall in recent months a controversy about smoky bacon crisps, where there was an accusation that because of changes in EU regulations, we're going to have to change the ingredients in our smoky bacon crisps. When he spoke to crisp manufacturers, it was already happening anyway, and it was happening because they wanted to have access to such a large market on our doorstep. So it's an active choice this government has made, and I'm, as you've seen from me giving a speech today in the way that I have, it's a debate that we very much relish going forward.
While you were talking, I was listening, but I did just check my WhatsApps and somebody sent me the original Smoky Bacon story and it was written in the Telegraph by my dear friend James Crisp. But how did I not know that?
Should have remembered that, Adam.
Great bit of nominative determinism there. Now, you talked about the supermarkets welcoming all of this, and because if there's fewer barriers to trade and fewer kind of standards things getting in the way, then they can pass on savings to consumers. But I saw a thing in the papers last week where the supermarkets were all warning that actually if business rates change in the way that Rachel Reeves has suggested, then supermarkets will have to pass on extra costs to their customers. So what's the point of potentially saving supermarkets some money in one area but forcing them to pay more in another?
Well, look, in terms of...
And I know you're not a Treasury Minister, so you can't go into all the nuts and bolts of that, but just address the principle.
Well, in terms of the principle you're talking about around business rates, for example, obviously you wouldn't expect me to anticipate what the Chancellor, whether it's on that particular rate or indeed anything else in the budget, and it would indeed be irresponsible of me to start doing that. But can I take your broad point, which is, well, what are we doing generally about the cost of living? What are we generally doing about the cost of food in supermarkets? Well, first and foremost, we've had to take difficult decisions to stabilise the economy. That is what the Chancellor has been doing. We inherited a level of debt. We inherited a situation where we had that £22 billion black hole that we had to fill. We made difficult decisions to stabilise the public finances, but we now move into a phase where we're trying to build that fairer Britain, help people with the cost of living. And for supermarkets, as well as other businesses, firstly, it's important we have that rock of economic stability, which is what this government is building everything upon. But secondly, there is no doubt at all that securing the trade deals we have is a vote of confidence in our economy, that economies like India or the United States and indeed the EU, three massive economic powers in the world, are all willing to have these closer economic ties with us.
Okay, so it's the day after Nigel Farage's big speech about his deportations policy, although I noted after yesterday's newscast that actually the technical word for a lot of what he's talking about is returns. So he's trying to get us to use different language, but let's just park that issue. I've got two questions for you. Number one, are you okay as a government minister with the idea of sending migrants back to Afghanistan? Because yesterday Number 10 said that they were open to the idea of negotiating a returns agreement with Afghanistan. Would you be okay if that happened?
Well, it already does happen. We already return asylum seekers with no right to be here to Afghanistan. That's already been happening.
On the basis of a deal with the Afghan government?
You can still do these things without that. And that is what the government has already been doing. What I saw from Nigel Farage yesterday was stoking of a grievance, then a series of empty, unworkable promises to solve it. He was talking about detaining people, but wouldn't tell anybody where. He was then talking about and asked about what would happen with women and children. He had no idea. He then talked about, to your point, wanting to do these specific deals with hostile governments around the world, and he wants to apparently negotiate those. You can't negotiate the politics of a parliamentary party that can fit in the back of a taxi, so I don't really put a great deal of confidence in his ability to do that. And to your point, I find it quite extraordinary that when he was talking about his priority for a deal with another country, he was talking about a deal with the Taliban, but doesn't, it appears, want to do a deal with the European Union, with which we have £800 billion worth of trade. I mean, that's just not a serious position.
Okay, then somebody on your own side, Jack Straw, former Home Secretary, and the man who did the Human Rights Act, which put the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic law. Jack Straw told the Financial Times today that he thinks maybe we should be decoupling, in his word, UK law from the European Convention on Human Rights. Do you think he's got a point?
Well, the approach that the government is taking is, first of all, to, what Jack has been saying, to look, yes, at the implementation by our courts, the interpretation of both Article 3 and indeed Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Home Secretary is leading that work at the moment, so we will be looking at how that is being interpreted. But to the wider point that is often made here by people like Nigel Farage and others, that somehow leaving the European Convention on Human Rights is a silver bullet to solving the issue of the boats, small boats in the English Channel. Really, that is not the case at all. In fact, that would make our position so much weaker. It would be so much harder to get the international agreements that we need to tackle this issue. That's what we've been doing in terms of our one-in, one-out deal with France in order to send back people who arrive here. Also, the deal with France in terms of changing their maritime law so that they can intercept the small boats up to 300 metres from their shore. So the idea of leaving the ECHR would make the situation far harder to solve, and Nigel Farage is completely wrong about that.
And we should just end for newscasters with some ECHR bingo, which we just played there. Article 3 is the prohibition on torture, inhuman and degrading treatment. And Article 8 is the right to family life. It's for people who don't know the treaty as well as you do. But then it is your job in the Cabinet Office. Nick, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. Pleasure.